Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 27 years old and finally taking that romantic getaway we'd been promising ourselves for months, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided on Colorado for our long weekend trip. We'd been together for 3 years, both working demanding jobs in Denver's tech scene, and honestly, we needed this break more than we realized. Sarah worked as a software engineer at a startup that had her pulling 60-hour weeks, while I was grinding through my second year as a data analyst at a consulting firm. The plan was simple: rent a cabin near Aspen, disconnect from our phones, and remember why we fell for each other in the first place. We'd left Friday evening, loaded up my Honda Civic with weekend bags, snacks, and Sarah's vintage Polaroid camera she insisted on bringing everywhere. The drive was supposed to take about 4 hours, but we'd gotten a late start after Sarah's last-minute work crisis, so we were pushing through mountain roads as the sun started setting behind the peaks. The Colorado Rockies in October are something else entirely. Massive walls of stone and pine trees that seem to stretch into infinity, painted in shades of gold and crimson that no photo could ever capture. We'd been winding through Highway 82 for about an hour, Sarah navigating with an actual paper map because our GPS kept losing signal in the mountains. The road twisted and turned like a serpent, each curve revealing another breathtaking vista that made us both gasp and point like tourists. Sarah had her window cracked, letting in that crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and something wild I couldn't name. We were laughing about something stupid, probably one of my terrible jokes, when the music from her carefully curated road trip playlist suddenly cut out. The radio started crackling with static, and Sarah reached over to fiddle with the tuner, trying to find a clear station. That's when we rounded a particularly sharp bend and saw the car. It was a dark blue sedan, maybe a Toyota or Honda, positioned at an odd angle across the narrow mountain road, like someone had lost control and spun out. The hazard lights were blinking in that hypnotic rhythm that immediately puts you on edge, casting orange reflections off the guardrail and the rocky cliff face. What struck me as strange right away was how perfectly the car was positioned, not quite blocking the road entirely, but placed in such a way that any passing vehicle would have to slow down significantly and squeeze around it. A man stood near the driver's side door, and the moment our headlights hit him, he started waving his arms frantically above his head. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and jeans, probably in his 40s with thinning brown hair and a face that looked genuinely distressed. Sarah immediately reached for her seatbelt, leaning forward to get a better look. "Oh God, should we stop?" she asked, her voice filled with that instinctive concern that makes you want to help. The guy was gesturing toward his car, then toward us, mouthing words we couldn't hear through our closed windows. But something nagged at me as I slowed down, my foot hovering between the brake and gas pedal. The car didn't look damaged, no visible dents, no steam rising from the hood, no shattered glass glittering in our headlights. The positioning was too convenient, too strategic for a real accident on such a treacherous curve. I'd driven mountain roads before, and when cars actually lose control on these turns, they usually end up smashed against the guardrail or tumbled down the embankment, not sitting pretty in the middle of the road like a roadblock. The man's movements seemed almost rehearsed, too theatrical, like he was performing distress rather than actually experiencing it. Sarah noticed my hesitation and looked at me with confusion. "What are you doing? We have to help him," she said, but I could hear a slight uncertainty creeping into her voice too. The whole scene had this artificial quality that made my skin crawl, like watching a play where the actors had forgotten they were supposed to convince the audience. As we got closer, I noticed the man's eyes weren't focused on us with the desperate gratitude you'd expect from someone genuinely in need. Instead, he was scanning our car with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. "Drive," I said suddenly, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. Sarah whipped her head toward me, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "What? No, we can't just leave him there." but I pressed down on the accelerator, steering around the sedan with barely 2 feet to spare between us and the rocky cliff wall. The man's expression changed instantly when he realized we weren't stopping. The fake distress melted away and was replaced by something much colder, more calculating. He stepped forward aggressively, actually moving toward our car as we passed, and I caught a glimpse of his face in my side mirror. His mouth was set in a hard line, and his eyes held a fury that sent chills down my spine. Sarah was gripping the door handle, turning in her seat to look back at him. Jesus Christ, what if he really needed help? She demanded, but her voice was shaking now. The man stood in the road watching us drive away, no longer waving or calling out, just standing there with his arms at his sides like a predator that had missed its chance at prey. The image of him in that red flannel shirt, motionless against the backdrop of his perfectly positioned car, burned itself into my memory. We drove in tense silence for maybe 3 minutes, Sarah occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of anger and confusion. The mountain road ahead was empty, just endless curves disappearing into shadows cast by towering pines. I kept checking my rearview mirror, but all I could see were our own taillights reflecting off the guardrail and the pitch-black wilderness beyond. Sarah finally broke the silence. I can't believe you just left that guy there. What if his car really broke down? What if he's stranded up here all night? I started to explain my gut feeling, how the whole thing seemed staged, but before I could get the words out, headlights appeared in my mirror. At first, I thought it might be another traveler, maybe someone else who had stopped to help the stranded motorist. But as the lights grew brighter and closer, I realized this vehicle was moving fast, much faster than was safe on these winding mountain roads. The headlights were positioned high off the ground, suggesting a truck or SUV, and they were gaining on us with an urgency that made my chest tighten. Sarah noticed my grip tightening on the steering wheel and turned to look behind us. "Oh shit," she whispered, and I knew she could see what I was seeing. This wasn't just another car heading down the mountain. The headlights behind us were now close enough that I could make out the outline of a large pickup truck, dark-colored, maybe black or deep blue. It was riding our bumper aggressively, maybe 15 feet back on a road where you should maintain at least 100 feet of distance. Every time we hit a straightaway, the truck would surge forward, getting so close I expected to feel the impact of a rear-end collision. Then, as we entered the next curve, it would back off just enough to avoid hitting us, like the driver knew exactly how to maintain maximum intimidation without actually making contact. Sarah was now fully turned around in her seat, staring at the truck's blazing headlights. "Can you see who's driving?" I asked through gritted teeth, my knuckles white as I navigated a particularly sharp turn. She squinted against the glare. "The windshield's too dark, but I think there are 2 people in the front seat, maybe more." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. The truck's headlights were so bright they completely washed out my rearview mirror, making it impossible to see anything beyond that blinding white light. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was connected to the man with the fake breakdown, that we'd stumbled into some kind of trap designed to prey on good Samaritans traveling these isolated mountain roads. The chase continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The truck stayed with us through every twist and turn, never quite close enough to force us off the road, but never far enough back to let us relax. During one particularly harrowing stretch where the road hugged the edge of a steep ravine, the truck suddenly accelerated and pulled into the oncoming lane, drawing alongside us. Sarah screamed and grabbed my arm as the massive vehicle loomed next to our little Honda, its engine roaring like some mechanical beast. For a terrifying moment, I thought they were going to ram us sideways, sending us tumbling down the mountainside into the darkness below. But instead, the truck just paced us, staying parallel for maybe 30 seconds while I pressed the accelerator to the floor, my little 4-cylinder engine whining in protest. Through the truck's passenger window, which was rolled down despite the cold mountain air, I could see the shadowy outline of someone leaning toward us. They weren't shouting or gesturing. They were just watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as they had pulled alongside us, they dropped back behind us again, resuming their menacing pursuit. Sarah was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face as she kept looking between me and the road ahead, searching desperately for any sign of civilization, any escape from this nightmare that had materialized out of nowhere. That's when I spotted the turnoff, a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the dense forest, marked only by a weathered wooden sign that read, Forest Service Road 307. It wasn't much, but it was our only option. Without warning Sarah, I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, our tires squealing as we careened onto the unpaved road. The truck shot past the turnoff, its brake lights flashing red as the driver realized what had happened. Sarah was thrown against the passenger door by the sudden turn, her seatbelt cutting into her shoulder. "What are you doing?" she gasped, but I was already accelerating down the dirt road, rocks and debris pinging against our undercarriage. In my rearview mirror, I could see the truck's reverse lights as it backed up on the main highway, trying to follow us onto the Forest Service Road. The narrow track was barely wide enough for one vehicle, with thick pine trees pressing in on both sides and deep ruts that made our car bounce and jolt with every yard we covered. My headlights carved through the absolute darkness ahead, revealing nothing but more forest, more uncertainty. Behind us, the truck had managed to turn around and was now pursuing us down the dirt road, its larger tires handling the rough terrain much better than our low-clearance Honda. We drove deeper into the wilderness for what felt like an eternity, the truck's headlights growing brighter and closer with each passing minute. The Forest Service Road was getting progressively worse, and I began to panic that we might get stuck or blow a tire, leaving us completely helpless in the middle of nowhere. Sarah had stopped crying and was now eerily quiet, her breathing shallow and rapid. Just when I thought we were trapped, the road opened up into a small clearing where I could see the dim outline of a cabin with a single light glowing in one window. Without hesitation, I pulled right up to the front porch and started honking the horn frantically, laying on it with both hands. The truck behind us suddenly stopped about 50 yards back, its headlights still blazing but no longer advancing. An elderly man emerged from the cabin, wearing a bathrobe and carrying what looked like a shotgun. He was probably in his 70s, with wild gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades living in the mountains. "What the hell's going on out here?" he shouted, squinting against our headlights. I rolled down my window and yelled back, "There's a truck following us. They've been chasing us for miles." The old man raised his shotgun and aimed it directly at the truck's headlights. "This is private property," he bellowed into the darkness. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around and get out of here before I start shooting." For a moment, nothing happened, just the sound of idling engines and our own terrified breathing. Then slowly the truck began to reverse, its headlights sweeping across the trees as it backed down the narrow Forest Service road. We sat there in stunned silence, watching those lights disappear into the darkness until we couldn't see them anymore. The old man kept his shotgun raised for another full minute before finally lowering it and walking over to our car. His name was Frank, and he'd been living in that cabin for over 20 years, ever since he retired from working as a park ranger. When we told him about the fake accident and the chase, his expression grew grim. "You're not the first folks to come tearing down this road in the middle of the night," he said, shaking his head. "There's been reports of people getting robbed, worse things happening to travelers who stopped to help on that stretch of highway. You did the right thing not stopping." He invited us inside for coffee and let us use his landline to call the state police, though he warned us that response times in this area could be hours. The cabin was small but cozy, filled with hunting trophies and old photographs of mountain landscapes. Frank's presence was incredibly reassuring. This tough old mountain man who clearly didn't scare easily had validated our terror, confirmed that we hadn't been paranoid or cruel for not stopping to help. We ended up spending the night on Frank's couch, too shaken to attempt driving back to the main highway in the dark. The next morning, he guided us back to Highway 82 using a different Forest Service road that bypassed the area where we'd encountered the fake accident. The state police had found the abandoned sedan during their overnight patrol. It had been reported stolen from Denver 3 days earlier. They never caught the people in the truck, but Frank told us that after word got around about the incident, the fake accidents stopped happening on that particular stretch of road. Sarah and I eventually made it to our cabin rental, though we cut the trip short by a day and drove home during daylight hours. Even now, 2 years later, whenever we're driving through unfamiliar territory and see a car broken down on the side of the road, we call 911 instead of stopping directly. That night taught us that the instinct to help can sometimes be dangerous, and that trusting your gut when something feels wrong isn't paranoia, it's survival. We never found out exactly what those people had planned for travelers who stopped to help, and honestly, I'm grateful we never had to find out. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'd been on the road for 6 hours when the engine temperature needle started creeping into the red. It was late afternoon, somewhere past the last gas station I'd seen in over 30 miles. I'd taken a detour off the main highway to avoid a traffic jam near the state line, and ended up surrounded by endless stretches of farmland and pine trees. I was driving a second-hand Corolla I bought 3 months earlier, and up to that point, it had been reliable enough for small trips. This was my first long-distance drive alone, from Georgia to visit an old college friend in Texas. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt out there. Not peaceful quiet, hollow quiet. Like even the wind was trying not to stir anything up. When the dashboard warning light blinked on and a hiss of steam escaped under the hood, I pulled over beside a ditch and shut everything down. I waited a few minutes, hoping maybe it would just stop, but the engine still sounded like it was boiling. I popped the hood and stepped out, immediately hit by the heat rising off the metal. There was no smoke, but the smell, kind of metallic and sour, told me I wasn't going anywhere soon. I didn't have signal. I held my phone up toward the sky like that would make a difference. I walked up and down the shoulder, phone in the air, until I saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. The truck slowed before I even waved. An older couple sat up front. The man had a baseball cap with oil smudges along the rim, and the woman had pale hair tied back in a pink bandana. They looked like the kind of people you'd see in a Cracker Barrel parking lot, sipping sweet tea in lawn chairs. "You need help, sweetheart?" she asked, leaning over the open window. I explained what happened, and before I could finish, she looked over at the man, who nodded. "There's a mechanic not far from here. Not exactly a business, but we trust him. He's helped us before," she said. I hesitated, just long enough for her to notice, and she added, "He's real kind. Works out of a barn, maybe 10 minutes up the road." I didn't like the idea of getting in a stranger's truck, but the sun was going down and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. They weren't pushy, just patient, like they already knew I'd say yes. I climbed in, holding my backpack in my lap like some kind of shield. The woman chatted most of the way, telling me about how the mechanic used to fix tractors around town, how folks didn't trust big repair shops anymore. I noticed there weren't any signs on the road, no mile markers, no street names, just turns down gravel paths and dips into tree-lined cuts of land that all started looking the same. Eventually, we turned off into a narrow dirt driveway and pulled up to a dark red barn with no lights on and no cars around. Just the barn, and silence. The man tapped the horn twice, and a single light flickered on inside the barn. Not overhead, more like a standing lamp someone had dragged into the middle of the space. A few seconds later, a tall, heavy-set guy appeared in the doorway. He wore dark overalls and had a full beard that looked stiff, like the bristles of an old broom. He didn't say much, just nodded once and motioned for me to come closer. The couple told me they'd head back home and that I'd be in good hands. "He's got a phone inside if you need to call someone," the woman added, but didn't wait for a reply. Before I could say thank you, their truck was already backing out. No dust trail, no taillights after a few seconds, just gone. Inside the barn, the light barely reached the corners. There were metal shelves with old cans and tools I didn't recognize, a workbench cluttered with greasy rags, and the smell, stronger now, a mix of rust, oil, and something sour I couldn't name. The mechanic pointed to a folding chair against the wall and told me to wait there while he went to look at the car. I asked if he had a phone I could use, and he said, "Signal's tricky out here. Better to wait." His voice was low and gravelly, like he didn't talk much anymore. Then he disappeared outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The chair wobbled when I sat down. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I tried sending a message anyway, just in case it would go through later. I listened for the sound of the barn door opening again, or maybe footsteps outside. But all I heard was the hum of bugs through the slats in the walls and something mechanical whirring in the distance, like a generator struggling to keep up. I waited. 10 minutes, 20. It was getting darker, and the light inside the barn started to feel dimmer too. I stood up to stretch and went to push the door open, but it didn't budge. That's when I noticed the outside latch. A thick metal padlock clicked into place. I called out, not yelling, just a sharp, "Hello?" like maybe he didn't mean to lock it. No answer. I tried again, louder. Nothing. That was the moment my throat started to feel dry, like I was swallowing around gravel. I went back to the chair, not sure what else to do. There were no windows, just thin wooden slats with gaps too narrow to see through. I tried using the flashlight on my phone, but the battery had dropped to 7%, and I didn't want to waste it. I thought about pushing the door again, harder, but something about the stillness made me hesitate, like the barn itself was listening, like it wanted me to stay quiet. I started looking around more carefully, not just scanning, but really noticing things. On the far end of the barn, behind a loose tarp draped over what looked like a pile of tires, I spotted something that made my jaw clench. Shoes. A line of them. All different sizes and styles. Worn-down sneakers, work boots, a single red flat like something a kid might wear. They weren't tossed around like junk. They were lined up side by side almost too neatly. I walked over slowly, half expecting to hear someone behind me, but the barn stayed quiet. I reached out and lifted the edge of the tarp, and that's when I saw the second thing, an old duffel bag with a torn zipper. Inside were toiletries, a pair of glasses, and a set of car keys labeled Terry on a worn-out keychain. I backed away. I wasn't thinking clearly at that point. My legs felt stiff and unsteady, like I'd been sitting for hours even though I knew it hadn't been that long. I went back to the door and tried shouting again, this time really yelling. Nothing. Then I heard something. Not a voice, not footsteps, but the distant crunch of tires on gravel. I pressed my ear to the wall and caught the low rumble of an engine. Not approaching. Leaving. I ran to the slats and crouched, trying to see anything through the cracks. I caught a flash of taillights disappearing into the trees. Same truck, same couple. They hadn't gone home, they'd waited. And now they were leaving. That's what made me panic. I picked up a rusty wrench from the workbench and started slamming it against the barn door. Over and over, screaming until my voice cracked. The lock didn't budge, but the door frame began to splinter just a little. I kept going. I don't know how long. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. Long enough that I didn't hear the other engine pulling up. A new one. Brighter headlights cutting through the cracks in the wood. A man's voice yelled from outside, something like, "You all right in there?" He'd seen the broken-down car, stopped, and heard the banging. He worked a nearby property and said he'd never seen a mechanic out here before, just a vacant old barn that hadn't been used in years. He broke the lock with a crowbar and pulled the door open. I could barely speak by then. Just ran out and didn't look back until we were on the road. I tried explaining, but I don't think I made much sense. He drove me into town, and the sheriff took a statement, but nothing came of it. No trace of the couple, no record of anyone owning that land. And the barn? Torn down the following week. Sheriff said it was unsafe. I still have the keychain. Terry. Sometimes I think about mailing it somewhere, but I don't even know where I'd send it. Nothing ever really explained what happened that day, but I stopped driving cross-country after that. I take planes now, even when it's more expensive. So I'm a long-haul trucker, been doing this for about 15 years now, and I've seen my share of weird stuff on the road. But what happened to me last month in Oregon still gives me chills when I think about it. I was driving my usual route from California up to Washington, just me and my rig, listening to some old country music and trying to make good time. It was a Tuesday evening in September, around 6:30 p.m., and I was somewhere between Eugene and Salem on Highway 5. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains, casting these long shadows across the road that made everything look kind of eerie. I'd been driving for about 8 hours straight and was getting pretty tired, but I wanted to push through and make it to my usual truck stop before calling it a night. The traffic was light, just the occasional car passing by, and I was feeling pretty relaxed despite the fatigue. That's when I saw her standing on the shoulder of the road, just past this little bridge over a creek. She was a woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing a dark blue jacket and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. Her brown hair was kind of messy, like she'd been walking for a while, and she had her thumb out in that classic hitchhiker pose. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, company policy and all that, but something about the way she was standing there, so still and quiet, made me feel sorry for her. Maybe it was the way the fading light was hitting her, or maybe I was just feeling lonely after hours of driving alone, but I found myself slowing down and pulling over. I rolled down my passenger window and called out to her, asking where she was headed. She walked over to my truck without saying a word, just nodded when I asked if she needed a ride north. There was something about her movements that seemed off, like she was walking through water or something, but I figured she was just tired from being on the road. She climbed up into the cab without any trouble, though I noticed she didn't make any sound when her feet hit the metal steps. Most people make at least a little noise climbing into a truck, you know. But she was silent as a ghost. When she settled into the passenger seat, I got my first good look at her face. She was pale, really pale, with these dark circles under her eyes that made her look like she hadn't slept in days. Her lips had this weird bluish tint to them, like she was cold, even though it was still pretty warm outside. What really got to me, though, were her eyes. They were this strange grayish color, and she wouldn't look directly at me. Every time I tried to make eye contact, she'd turn her head toward the window or stare down at her lap. I asked her name, where she was coming from, the usual small talk you make with a passenger, but she just shrugged or nodded. The only time she spoke was when I asked where she wanted to be dropped off, and even then it was just a whisper. Gas station up ahead. The weird thing was, I couldn't smell anything from her. You know how people have a scent, whether it's perfume, soap, sweat, whatever. She had nothing. It was like sitting next to empty air, and the temperature in the cab seemed to drop a few degrees after she got in, which was strange because my heater was working fine, and it wasn't that cold outside. I kept glancing over at her as we drove, trying to figure out what was making me feel so uneasy. She sat perfectly still, didn't fidget or move around like most passengers do, didn't even seem to be breathing heavily. Her jacket looked damp in some spots, with these dark stains that could have been water or mud, but they had this weird pattern to them, like they'd been there for a while. The silence in the cab was getting uncomfortable, so I turned up the radio a bit, but she didn't react to the music at all. Most people at least tap their foot or nod along, but she just sat there like a statue, staring out the windshield with those empty gray eyes. About 20 minutes into the ride, I started noticing other strange things. The CB radio, which usually crackles with chatter from other truckers, went completely silent, not even static. I tried adjusting the volume and switching channels, but it was like the thing had just died. Then my GPS started acting up, showing my location as being about 3 miles off the highway in the middle of some forest, even though we were clearly on the main road. The strangest part was when I looked in my rearview mirror. I could see the back of my cab just fine, but I couldn't see her reflection anywhere. I thought maybe it was the angle or the lighting, so I adjusted the mirror a few times, but no matter how I positioned it, she just wasn't there. My heart started beating faster, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead despite the cool air in the cab. I tried to convince myself it was just the weird lighting from the sunset, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I glanced over at her again, I noticed her skin had an almost translucent quality to it, like I could see the veins underneath, but they were dark, almost black instead of blue. The exit for the gas station was coming up, and I'd never been so relieved to see those bright fluorescent lights in my life. As I slowed down and took the off-ramp, she finally turned her head toward me, and for just a split second, our eyes met. What I saw in those gray eyes will haunt me forever. They were completely empty, like looking into a deep well at night. There was no life in them, no spark, nothing that made them human. And her skin, now that I was really looking at it up close, had this waxy quality that reminded me of, well, of the funeral home where we held my dad's service a few years back. I pulled up to the gas station and put the truck in park, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. She opened the passenger door without a word, climbed down from the cab with that same weird fluid movement, and started walking toward the convenience store. I called out, "Hey, take care of yourself." But she didn't turn around or acknowledge me in any way. She just kept walking with this strange, gliding gait, like her feet weren't quite touching the ground. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm my nerves and make sense of what had just happened. The temperature in the cab went back to normal almost immediately after she left, and my CB radio suddenly came alive with trucker chatter again. My GPS corrected itself too, showing my actual location at the gas station. I needed coffee badly and figured I should fill up my tank while I was there, so I climbed down from the cab and headed into the store. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in, and I looked around for the woman, but she was nowhere to be seen. The place wasn't that big, just a few aisles of snacks and drinks, a coffee station, and a counter where a young guy named Tommy was working the register. I grabbed a large coffee and some beef jerky, still feeling shaky from the whole experience. When I got to the counter, Tommy looked at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost, man. Everything all right?" I almost laughed at how accurate that comment was, but instead I just told him I'd picked up a hitchhiker and dropped her off here. A woman in a dark blue jacket with brown hair. Tommy's expression changed immediately. His face went white, and he leaned forward over the counter. "Wait, what did she look like exactly?" he asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I described her in detail, the pale skin, the gray eyes, the bluish lips, the way she moved. As I talked, Tommy kept shaking his head and muttering, no way," under his breath. When I finished, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dude, you're the second person today who's told me about picking up a woman matching that exact description. Some guy in a red pickup came in around noon, said he'd given her a ride and dropped her off here too. But here's the thing." He paused and glanced around the store like he was making sure no one else was listening. "That woman died 3 nights ago in a car accident about 2 miles from where you probably picked her up. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she was heading to visit her sister when she crashed her car into that creek by the bridge. They pulled her body out of the water the next morning. My coffee cup slipped from my hand and hit the floor, splashing hot liquid everywhere, but I barely noticed. The room started spinning, and I had to grab the counter to steady myself. Tommy grabbed some paper towels and started cleaning up the spilled coffee while I tried to process what he'd just told me. "Are you sure it was the same woman?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He nodded grimly and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a local news app. "Here," he said, showing me the screen. "This is the article about the accident." The headline read, "Local woman dies in single car crash," and below it was a photo that made my heart stop. It was her, the same face, the same brown hair, even the same dark blue jacket she'd been wearing in my truck. But in the photo, she was smiling and alive, with bright eyes and rosy cheeks. Nothing like the empty shell I'd encountered on the highway. According to the article, Jennifer Walsh, 34, had lost control of her vehicle during a rainstorm and crashed through the guardrail into Pine Creek. Her body had been recovered after a 2-day search. Tommy put his phone away and looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and fear. The other guy who came in earlier, he was pretty shaken up too. Said she didn't talk much and seemed really cold. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. You both picked up a dead woman. I couldn't speak for a solid minute. Everything started making sense in the most terrifying way possible. The cold temperature in my cab, the lack of reflection in my mirror, the way she moved like she was underwater. Those lifeless gray eyes. I'd given a ride to a ghost, a spirit of someone who died in that very spot just 3 days ago. Tommy kept talking, telling me that the accident happened around dusk, just like when I'd seen her, and that her car had been found upside down in the creek with the driver's side door open. They think she tried to get out and got swept away by the current, he explained. Her body was found downstream, caught in some branches. The weird thing is, witnesses said they saw someone walking along that stretch of highway the night after the accident, but when police investigated, they never found anyone. I realized I was breathing heavily, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. The rational part of my brain wanted to find some logical explanation, but I knew what I'd experienced. I'd seen her, touch the same door handle she'd used, breathe the same air. There was no denying it. I'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. I stayed at that gas station for another hour, talking to Tommy and trying to make sense of everything. He told me that the local sheriff's department had been getting reports of hitchhiker sightings along that stretch of highway ever since the accident, but they'd stopped investigating after the third or fourth call. Most folks around here just avoid picking up anyone on that road now, Tommy said. Word travels fast in a small town. As we talked, I learned that Jennifer had been driving to her sister's house for their mother's birthday dinner when the accident happened. She'd been running late because of work and had taken the highway instead of the back roads she usually preferred. The irony wasn't lost on me. She died trying to get somewhere, and now she was still trying to get there, accepting rides from strangers who had no idea they were helping a dead woman continue her final journey. I asked Tommy what he thought I should do, and he just shrugged. Nothing you can do, really. You helped her get closer to where she needed to go. Maybe that's enough. His words gave me a strange sense of peace, like maybe I'd done something good without knowing it. I finally got back in my truck around 9 p.m. and continued north to Washington, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer Walsh. The rest of my drive was uneventful, thankfully, and I made it to my destination without any more supernatural encounters. But over the next few weeks, I found myself researching the accident online, reading everything I could find about her life and death. She'd been a school teacher, loved hiking, and had been planning to move closer to her sister's family. It made the whole experience feel more real and heartbreaking, knowing she'd been an actual person with hopes and dreams, not just some scary ghost story. I've driven that same route dozens of times since then, always slowing down near that bridge and looking for her, but I haven't seen her again. Maybe she finally made it to where she needed to go, or maybe she only appears to certain people at certain times. I'll never know for sure, but I do know that I'll never forget the night I gave a ride to someone who was already gone. Sometimes I wonder if other drivers have had similar experiences and just never talked about it, too afraid people would think they're crazy. But I know what happened to me was real, and I hope that somehow, some way, I helped Jennifer find peace. The drive from California to Ohio was supposed to be straightforward. 3 days of interstate highways, truck stops, and maybe some decent music on the radio. I'm Jake, 28 years old, and at the time I was living in Sacramento, putting in long hours at a warehouse to make ends meet. The reason for the trip was my sister Emma's wedding in Cleveland, and honestly, I was pretty excited about it. She'd been dating this guy Michael for 4 years, and they seemed really happy together. I'd saved up for months to afford the gas and a decent wedding gift, planning to sleep in my Ford Ranger along the way to keep costs down. The first 2 days went perfectly, made good time through Nevada and into Nebraska without any problems at all. What happened next still keeps me up at night sometimes. I was about 6 hours into Nebraska, somewhere between nowhere and the middle of nowhere, when I realized I was running dangerously low on cash. Credit cards are great until they're not. and I'd learned the hard way that some gas stations in rural areas still prefer cash, especially for truck drivers passing through. The GPS showed a small town called Millfield about 15 miles ahead, so I figured I'd stop there, grab some money from an ATM, maybe stretch my legs and get a coffee. The sun was starting to set, painting the endless cornfields this weird orange color that made everything look like a postcard. I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed, how different it was from the constant noise and chaos of the city. When I first rolled into Millfield, the place struck me as the kind of town time forgot. Main Street was maybe 4 blocks long with those old-fashioned brick buildings that probably looked exactly the same in 1950 as they did that day. There was a small diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store with dusty windows, and what looked like a post office that doubled as the town hall. The streets were completely empty, except for a few pickup trucks parked at odd angles, like their owners had just abandoned them mid-errand. I drove slowly down Main Street looking for a bank or at least an ATM, and that's when I spotted it. A lone ATM machine standing outside what used to be a bank, judging by the faded First National painted on the brick wall behind it. I pulled up right in front of the ATM and stepped out of my truck, immediately noticing how quiet everything was. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of air conditioners or lawnmowers. Even the wind seemed to have stopped completely, which was strange because Nebraska is usually pretty breezy. The only sound was my footsteps on the cracked sidewalk and the distant rumble of my truck's engine cooling down. I walked up to the ATM, inserted my debit card, and started punching in my PIN. The machine made these weird clicking noises, like it was thinking really hard about something, and then the screen flashed processing for what felt like forever. Then without warning, the thing just ate my card. Not like it malfunctioned. It literally pulled my card in and refused to give it back, no matter how many times I pressed the cancel button. Great. Just perfect. Here I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere with maybe $30 in my wallet and no debit card. I stood there for a good 5 minutes, pressing every button on that machine, even trying to peer inside the card slot to see if I could spot my card. Nothing. The screen just kept flashing, transaction complete, which was a complete lie since I hadn't gotten any money or my card back. I decided to look around for help. Maybe the diner was still open, or somebody at the hardware store could point me toward whoever maintained this piece of junk ATM. That's when I started noticing the houses. They were all occupied. I could tell because there were lights on in most of the windows and cars in the driveways. But something was wrong with the whole picture. As I walked down the sidewalk toward the diner, I became aware that people were watching me. Not openly. I never actually saw anyone standing in a doorway or sitting on a porch. But every house I passed, I could see the curtains moving slightly, like someone had just stepped away from the window. At first I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but then I started paying closer attention. Every single house, every single window, the curtains would shift just as I was about to look directly at them, like there was some kind of choreographed dance happening that I wasn't part of. I tried waving at one of the windows, thinking maybe I could get someone's attention and ask for help, but the curtain immediately snapped shut. The whole thing was giving me this creepy feeling, like being the only person awake in a town full of sleepwalkers. The diner's neon sign said, "Open," but when I pushed on the door, it was locked tight. I knocked a few times and peered through the windows, but the place was empty except for a few tables and chairs that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. Same story with the hardware store. Lights were on, but no one inside, and the door was locked. I started to realize that maybe this town wasn't as alive as I'd first thought, but then I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. In all my walking around, looking at all these houses with their occupied-looking windows and parked cars, I hadn't seen a single child. No bikes in the yards, no toys scattered around, no swing sets or trampolines. For a town this size, that was impossible. Every small town has kids running around, especially during summer evenings when I'd arrived. The absence of children made everything else seem even more wrong. I decided to try knocking on someone's door directly, Picked a house at random, a small white one with a red door and a porch light that was flickering on and off in this irregular pattern. Walked right up to the front door and knocked 3 times, loud enough that anyone inside would definitely hear me. Waited. Nothing. Knocked again, this time calling out, "Hello? I need some help with an ATM issue." There's still nothing, but I could swear I heard movement inside, like someone walking around trying to be quiet. The porch light kept flickering, and I noticed that the curtain in the front window was moving just slightly, like someone was breathing on it from the other side. I tried the doorbell, but it didn't make any sound, either broken or disconnected. After standing there for what felt like 10 minutes, I gave up and headed back toward my truck, feeling more unsettled with each step. When I got back to where I'd parked, I decided to cut my losses and just get out of there. I had enough cash to make it to the next bigger town, and I could deal with the missing debit card later by calling my bank. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened, not even a click. The engine was completely dead, which made no sense because it had been running perfectly fine just 20 minutes earlier. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal and checking that the gear was in park. Nothing. The radio wouldn't turn on, the headlights wouldn't come on. Even the little dome light inside the cab wouldn't work. It was like the entire electrical system had just died while I was walking around town. I popped the hood and took a look, but I'm no mechanic. Everything looked normal to me, no obvious loose wires or smoking parts. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the asphalt, like someone wearing heavy boots. I turned around and nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a man standing about 10 feet behind my truck, just watching me. He was maybe 60 years old, wearing faded jeans and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better decades. His face was weathered and deeply lined, with these pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. What really got to me was how he'd appeared. I hadn't heard him approach, hadn't seen him coming from any direction. One second I was alone. The next second he was just there, like he'd materialized out of thin air. He didn't say anything, just stood there with his arms at his sides, staring at me with this expression I couldn't read. Not threatening exactly, but not friendly either. Just waiting. Hi there," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm having some car trouble, and the ATM ate my card. Don't suppose you know who I could call for help?" The man tilted his head slightly, like he was considering my question very carefully, but still didn't speak. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then, without breaking eye contact, he raised one arm and pointed down the street toward the far end of town, where the road disappeared back into the cornfields. His meaning was pretty clear. Leave. Get out. Go that way and don't come back. But my truck still wouldn't start, and I told him so. That's when he did something that made every hair on my body stand up. He smiled. Not a normal smile, but this wide, empty grin that didn't reach his eyes at all. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out my debit card. My debit card. The one the ATM had eaten. I stared at that card in his hand, trying to process what I was seeing. There was no way he could have gotten it out of that machine. No way he could have known it was mine. No way any of this made sense. But there it was, and he was holding it out toward me like some kind of peace offering. I reached out to take it, and the second my fingers touched the plastic, I heard my truck's engine roar to life behind me. I spun around. The engine was running, headlights blazing like nothing had ever been wrong with it. When I turned back to thank the man or ask him what the hell was going on, he was gone. Completely gone. I looked up and down the street, checked behind the parked cars, even called out, "Hello?" a few times. Nothing. It was like he'd never been there at all. I didn't waste another second. I jumped in my truck, threw it in drive, and got the hell out of Millfield as fast as I could. Never looked back, never stopped until I hit the interstate. To this day, I have no idea what that place was or what those people wanted. But I know one thing for sure. I'm never driving through rural Nebraska again. After crossing into Arizona, I was too drained to keep driving. I'd been on the road since sunrise, trying to make it back to Arkansas after helping my cousin move out of her place near the Texas border. Somewhere past midnight, I pulled off the highway when I saw a flickering neon sign that said Vista Pines Motel, vacancy. It was one of those low L-shaped places with the rooms in a straight row, a vending machine by the office, and a parking spot in front of every door. The guy at the front desk looked half asleep, mid-40s maybe, bald with a long red beard that didn't seem to match his tired, pale face. I told him I just needed one night. He handed me a key with a giant plastic tag that said, Room 6, barely looked up and said, breakfast was just gas station donuts and bad coffee if I wanted it. That was fine by me. I just wanted a hot shower and a bed that didn't move. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Beige walls, scratchy sheets, and a weird damp smell, like someone had tried to cover mildew with lemon-scented cleaner. I double-locked the door and wedged the chair under the handle, a habit I picked up years ago during work travel. I was alone, hadn't spoken to anyone on the phone in hours, and was too tired to scroll through social media. The last thing I remember before falling asleep was the hum of the old AC unit and the low buzz of a distant semi-truck rolling past the highway. It was one of those sleeps where your body shuts down before your mind even realizes it. At exactly 2:03 a.m., I woke up to a distinct click. Not a knock, not a bang. A deliberate sound of metal sliding into metal. The door handle turned like someone had a key and was trying to come in quietly. The chair under the knob groaned, holding its ground. I shot up in bed and yelled, loud, not a word, just a raw, terrified sound. Whoever was out there froze for maybe half a second. Then I heard soft footsteps backing away fast down the sidewalk. I ran to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain, heart pounding. Nothing. The parking lot was empty except for my car, and the night was still. Too still. I didn't sleep again. I sat up in bed with the light on and my car keys clutched in one hand like that'd somehow help. When the sun came up, I marched straight to the front desk, trying to stay calm. A younger guy was on duty, probably mid-20s, dark circles under his eyes and chewing a toothpick like it was keeping him awake. I told him what happened. He raised his eyebrows and said, "That's not possible, you're the only one checked into room 6. I asked if they had cameras. He said they did. I asked if he could check." He walked into the back room, then came back a few minutes later and mumbled something about the hallway footage being accidentally overwritten during a system update. That's when I started feeling like I was being humored, like they wanted me out of there. I didn't argue. Something in his tone told me it wasn't worth it. I just grabbed a bitter coffee from the lobby and walked back to my car. The sun was already baking the pavement, and I was anxious to put miles between me and that place. I unlocked the door, tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, and that's when I saw it. A Polaroid photo sitting dead center on the dashboard. It hadn't been there the night before. It was slightly curled at the corners, like it had been handled more than once. I picked it up without thinking, flipped it over, and my legs nearly gave out. It was a picture of me, lying on the motel bed, eyes closed, blanket pulled up just past my waist. The bedside lamp was still on in the photo, just like it had been when I fell asleep. I looked around the parking lot like someone might be watching me. Nothing but the dried-up weeds along the chain-link fence and a row of empty rooms. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and just sat there with the engine running. The picture was still in my lap. I don't know how long I sat like that, but I remember my throat going dry and the weirdest feeling creeping in. Like the air inside the car had changed. Heavy, pressed in. That photo wasn't taken through the window. There was no glare, no distortion, and the angle was from inside the room. Whoever took it had been standing at the foot of the bed. I wanted to throw it out the window, but I couldn't. I shoved it in the glove box and peeled out of there so fast the tires screeched. I didn't stop until I hit a busy diner off the next exit, somewhere near the New Mexico state line. I sat in a booth for 2 hours, just watching people come and go. I kept thinking about how quiet the door handle had turned, how the chair was the only reason I even woke up, and the worst part, whoever it was, they didn't panic when I screamed. They didn't shout back or run. They just backed away, like they weren't surprised I woke up, like it was part of something they'd done before. Later that night, when I checked into a new motel farther down the highway, one with interior hallways and a front desk that actually paid attention, I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes for more than a few minutes. Every creak, every sound from the neighboring room made my chest tighten. I kept checking the lock. I moved the dresser in front of the door. And still, around 2 a.m., I jolted upright like my body remembered before my brain did. There was no one there, no sound this time. But I didn't sleep after that, and the next morning I couldn't bring myself to open the glove box. A week later, after I finally made it home, I opened the glove box again. The Polaroid was still there, curled at the edges like before. But now there was something else tucked behind it. A motel key. Same kind I'd used, with the plastic tag. But this one said room 7. I never stayed in room 7. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself maybe the desk guy had made a mistake and slipped in an extra key by accident. But I remembered clearly. He handed me only one. And I'd never opened the glove box that night. Not once. I hadn't needed to. I called the Vista Pines Motel a few days later. A woman answered this time, older voice, said she'd been working there for years. When I asked about room 7, there was a pause. Not long, but just enough. Then she said that room had been out of service for a while due to water damage. I asked since when. She said late last year. I asked if anyone had recently tried to check into it. She said it wasn't possible. I hung up before she could ask why I was calling. I didn't know what I would have said anyway. I didn't want to hear another lie. I ended up mailing the photo and the key to a friend of mine in law enforcement, someone I used to work with years ago. I didn't ask him to investigate. I just told him, keep these somewhere that's not near me. He texted back a few days later saying he'd gotten them and that he'd locked them away. That was the end of our conversation. We haven't talked about it since. I haven't told anyone else, not my family, not even my therapist, because I can't explain what happened in a way that sounds sane. I still don't know how someone got into that room. I still don't know how they got that photo, or why they left that key. But I think about it every night around 2 a.m. Whether I'm on the road or at home, I always wake up around that time now. And sometimes I lie there, perfectly still, listening for a click I haven't heard again, but might. The only thing I'm sure of is this. Someone else had a key to my room that night. Someone stood at the foot of that bed. And if I hadn't wedged that chair under the handle, I don't think I'd be here typing this now. Austin and I had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight when we decided to take that detour. We were both junior year students at Indiana University, just two regular guys on spring break trying to make it to his cousin's place in Utah without spending a fortune on hotels. Austin was this laid-back dude from Wisconsin who could sleep anywhere and never seemed to worry about anything, while I was always the cautious one, constantly checking our route and making sure we had enough gas. The whole trip had been going smoothly until we hit that stretch of highway in New Mexico, where the GPS started acting weird, showing us roads that didn't seem to exist and giving us directions that made no sense. We'd been joking about how we were probably going to end up as one of those horror movie cliches, college kids lost in the desert, but neither of us was actually worried yet. That changed pretty quickly. The main highway had been packed with traffic all day, and when Austin spotted what looked like a shortcut on the old paper map his dad had given him, we figured why not give it a shot. The exit ramp was barely marked, just a faded green sign that said, "Local access," with an arrow pointing right. As soon as we turned off, the landscape changed completely. The busy 4-lane highway with its constant stream of semis and RVs disappeared behind us, replaced by this narrow 2-lane road that cut through absolutely nothing but scrubland and scattered Joshua trees. The silence was immediate and unsettling. No engine noise from other cars. No distant hum of civilization. Just the sound of our tires on cracked asphalt and the wind whistling through Austin's slightly open window. After about 20 minutes of driving through this emptiness, our fuel gauge started dancing dangerously close to empty, and that's when we both started getting a little nervous about our brilliant shortcut idea. Just when I was about to suggest we turn around and head back to the highway, we crested a small hill and saw it, a single building sitting alone in the desert, like something out of an old Western movie. It was one of those ancient gas stations that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with 2 old-style pumps out front and a small convenience store attached. The whole place had this faded, sun-bleached look to it, with paint peeling off the walls and a hand-painted sign that just said gas in red letters that were barely visible anymore. What struck me as odd right away was that there were no other cars around, not a single vehicle in sight. But the lights were on inside the store, and one of the gas pumps had a handwritten working sign taped to it. Austin let out a relieved laugh and said something about our luck finally turning around. But honestly, the place gave me the creeps from the moment I laid eyes on it. Still, we were running on fumes at that point, so we didn't really have much choice in the matter. Austin pulled up to the working pump, and I got out to start filling the tank while he went inside to pay and grab some snacks for the road. The pump was one of those really old mechanical ones where you had to physically lift the handle and squeeze the trigger, and it made this loud clunking noise every time it dispensed gas, like the internal machinery was barely holding together. While I was standing there pumping gas, I kept glancing around at the surrounding desert, and I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were these deep tire tracks in the dirt all around the station, but they didn't lead to or from the road. Instead, they seemed to circle the building over and over again, like someone had been driving around and around the place for hours. Some of the tracks looked fresh, with sharp edges that hadn't been worn down by wind yet, while others were older and partially filled with sand. The pattern was so deliberate and repetitive that it couldn't have been accidental, and I found myself wondering what kind of person would drive in circles around a gas station in the middle of nowhere. When Austin came back out, he had this weird expression on his face that I'd never seen before. He was carrying a bag of chips and 2 bottles of water, but he walked really slowly to the car, like he was trying not to make any sudden movements. The moment he got close enough, he leaned over and whispered that the guy inside was seriously strange, and that we should get out of there as soon as possible. He told me the attendant was this tall, skinny man, probably in his 40s, wearing a faded blue work shirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. What really bothered Austin was that the guy never once looked directly at him during the entire transaction. Not when he asked how much gas we needed, not when Austin handed him the money, not even when he gave back the change. Instead, the attendant kept staring at something just over Austin's shoulder the whole time, and when Austin tried to make small talk about the weather or ask for directions back to the main highway, the guy would just mumble single-word answers like maybe or dunno without any context. Austin said it was like talking to someone who was only half there, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The weirdest part, according to Austin, was when he asked about the circular tire tracks outside. The attendant's whole demeanor changed instantly. He stopped moving completely, didn't even blink for what felt like a full minute, and then slowly turned his head to look directly at Austin for the first time. Austin described his eyes as being completely bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said, "People get lost out here sometimes. They drive around looking for the way back." Then he turned away again and started reorganizing items on the counter that were already perfectly organized, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. Austin said the way the guy said lost made it sound like he wasn't talking about being geographically lost, but something else entirely. As we were getting ready to leave, Austin glanced back through the store window and saw the attendant standing motionless behind the counter, still staring at that same spot over where Austin had been standing, like he was watching something invisible that only he could see. We drove away from that place as fast as we reasonably could without burning rubber, and for the next hour, neither of us said much about what had happened back there. The desert road eventually connected back to a main highway, and we found ourselves in a much more normal area, with regular traffic and well-maintained rest stops. By the time the sun started setting, we'd put about 60 miles between us and that creepy gas station, and we both started to relax a little. We decided to find a place to camp for the night since we were both getting tired, and Austin spotted a sign for a state camping area just off the highway. It wasn't anything fancy, just a basic campground with designated fire pits and picnic tables scattered around a flat area surrounded by low hills. There were only 2 other campsites occupied, both by families with RVs, and they were far enough away that we felt like we had plenty of privacy. We set up our tent as the last light was fading from the sky, cooked some hot dogs over a small campfire, and tried to convince ourselves that the weird encounter at the gas station was just one of those random, strange experiences you have on road trips. The temperature dropped pretty dramatically once the sun went down, which wasn't unusual for the desert, but what was unusual was how quiet everything became. Even the families in the RVs seemed to have gone to bed early, and there was no sound of traffic from the nearby highway, no insects chirping, no wind rustling through the sparse vegetation, just this heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press down on us from all directions. Austin and I were sitting by our dying campfire, talking quietly about our plans for the next day, when we heard it, the distant sound of an engine somewhere out in the darkness. At first it sounded like it was coming from the highway, maybe a semi-truck downshifting or something, but as we listened more carefully, we realized the sound wasn't moving in a straight line like it would if it was just passing traffic. Instead, it seemed to be circling around our general area, getting closer and then farther away in a pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of those tire tracks we'd seen at the gas station. The engine had this distinctive rough idle to it, like it needed a tune-up, and every few minutes it would stop completely for 30 seconds or so before starting up again. Austin and I exchanged nervous glances, and without saying anything, we both started kicking dirt over the fire to put it out completely. The last thing we wanted was to be visible from a distance if someone was really out there watching us. Once the fire was extinguished, we sat in total darkness for what felt like hours, listening to that engine continue its slow, methodical circling pattern around our campsite. Sometimes it sounded like it was maybe a quarter-mile away. Other times it seemed much closer, maybe just beyond the small ridge that surrounded our camping area. What really started to freak us out was that we never heard the sound of tires on gravel or pavement, just that rough engine noise floating through the air like the vehicle was somehow driving on perfectly smooth ground. Around midnight, the engine stopped completely and we thought maybe whoever it was had finally left. We were just starting to breathe normally again when Austin grabbed my arm and pointed toward a gap between 2 hills about 50 yards from our tent. There, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky, was the unmistakable shape of a person standing perfectly still, just watching us. The figure was tall and thin, and even though it was too dark to make out any details, something about the way it stood there was incredibly unsettling. It wasn't moving at all, no shifting weight from one foot to the other, no turning its head to look around, no normal human fidgeting or adjusting of position. It was like looking at a statue that had been placed there specifically to observe us. We stared at this figure for probably 10 minutes, neither of us daring to move or make a sound, and it never budged from that spot. Then Austin whispered something that made my blood run cold. He said the person was wearing what looked like a faded blue shirt, the same color as the gas station attendant's work shirt. At that moment, I realized we were dealing with something way beyond just a random creepy encounter. This person had somehow followed us 60 miles from that gas station, through highway traffic and multiple turns, and had managed to track us to this specific campsite. The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. But there was no denying what we were seeing with our own eyes. We stayed frozen in place for another 20 minutes, watching this figure watch us, until Austin slowly reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight app. The moment that bright beam cut through the darkness toward where the person had been standing, there was nothing there, just empty desert and scrub brush swaying slightly in a breeze we couldn't even feel. But here's the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. When Austin swept the flashlight beam across the ground where the figure had been, We could clearly see fresh footprints in the sandy dirt. Not just a few random prints, but a whole line of them leading from that spot down into a small wash and disappearing into the darkness. The prints were deep and evenly spaced, like someone had been walking very deliberately and putting their full weight into each step. What made it even more disturbing was that the prints seemed to circle our campsite in a wide arc, suggesting this person had been moving around us for who knows how long before we spotted them. Austin kept the flashlight on and slowly panned it across the entire area around our camp, and we could see more footprints scattered everywhere, some leading toward our tent, others heading back toward where we'd heard the engine sounds, all of them looking fresh and clearly made by the same person. Neither of us slept that night. We packed up our gear in complete silence, loaded everything into the car by flashlight, and drove straight through until we reached Austin's cousin's house in Utah the next afternoon. We never talked about it much after that. Not because we were trying to forget it, but because every time we brought it up, we'd remember details that made the whole experience even more terrifying than we'd initially realized. Austin did some research a few months later and found out that the gas station we'd stopped at had been closed for over 3 years according to county records, though he could never get a straight answer about who might still be hanging around there or why the pumps were still working. We both agreed never to take that route again, and to this day, whenever I'm on a road trip and see one of those isolated gas stations in the middle of nowhere, I just keep driving until I find somewhere with plenty of other customers around. Some encounters aren't worth the risk, and whatever was going on at that place was definitely something we were never meant to be part of. This whole thing has been messing with my head for months, and I finally decided to share it here because maybe someone can make sense of what happened. 3 of us were driving through southern Alabama last spring, heading back from a camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. I'm Brandon, and I was with my college buddies Nathan and Chris. We'd been tight since freshman year at Auburn, and these road trips had become our tradition, just escaping the routine for a few days. Chris had recently graduated with his engineering degree. Nathan was wrapping up his business major, and I had landed my first real position at a marketing firm in Birmingham. Everything felt normal that Wednesday afternoon, at least until we encountered her. We were cruising in Chris's beat-up Ford Explorer, windows rolled down, classic rock playing from the stereo, just 3 guys enjoying the drive home through those endless stretches of highway. The heat was brutal that day, probably pushing close to 90 degrees even though it was only April. We'd been on the road for about 4 hours, taking turns driving and stopping at random gas stations for snacks and drinks. Nathan was behind the wheel at this point. Chris was riding shotgun messing with the radio, and I was sprawled across the back seat with my feet up, half dozing from the combination of heat and road fatigue. The landscape around us was pretty desolate, just scrubland and the occasional cluster of trees, with those long, straight roads that seemed to stretch forever. We hadn't seen another car for maybe 20 minutes when Nathan suddenly slowed down and pointed ahead. There, maybe a quarter mile up the road, was a figure standing right on the shoulder, waving at us with both arms above their head. As we got closer, we could see it was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing hiking boots and what looked like outdoor gear. She had shoulder-length brown hair that was messy and tangled, and her clothes were dusty like she'd been walking for miles. When Nathan pulled the Explorer to a stop about 10 feet away from her, she immediately jogged toward us with this desperate expression on her face. Her cheeks were flushed red from the heat, and she had this frantic energy about her that made all of us sit up and pay attention. She came right up to Nathan's window, leaning down and speaking fast, almost breathless. "Thank God you stopped," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about 15 miles back, and I haven't seen a soul until now. Could you possibly give me a ride to the next town? I'll pay you for gas, whatever you need." The woman introduced herself as Lisa, and she explained that she'd been hiking alone in some state park about 30 miles north of where we found her. She said her car had overheated and died on some back road, and she'd been forced to walk to the main highway to find help. The story made sense. It was exactly the kind of thing that could happen to anyone in that heat, especially on those remote roads. Chris and Nathan exchanged glances, and I could tell they were both thinking the same thing I was. We couldn't just leave someone stranded out there. Nathan asked her which town she needed to get to, and she mentioned a place called Millbrook, which was about 40 minutes ahead on our route anyway. "That's perfect," Nathan told her. "We're heading that direction." Lisa's face lit up with relief, and she thanked us probably 5 times before we even unlocked the doors. She climbed into the back seat next to me, settling in with a heavy sigh and immediately commenting on how good the air conditioning felt. At first, everything seemed completely normal. Lisa was chatty and grateful, telling us about her hiking trip and how she'd underestimated the Alabama heat. She mentioned that she was from Florida originally, but had moved to Birmingham for a teaching job, which immediately got us talking since that's where I live too. We compared notes about restaurants and neighborhoods, and she seemed to know the city pretty well. Chris offered her one of our water bottles, and she drank it gratefully while fanning herself with a trail map she pulled from her backpack. The conversation flowed easily. She asked about our camping trip. We told her about some of the trails we'd hiked, and she shared stories about other outdoor adventures she'd been on. Nathan kept the explorer at a steady pace, and we all settled into what felt like a perfectly ordinary road trip conversation with a fellow hiker who'd gotten unlucky with her car. But then Lisa started mentioning things that made my skin crawl. During a lull in conversation, she casually said, "Brandon, that marketing firm where you work, is it the one on Highland Avenue?" I hadn't told her where I worked, only that I was in marketing. When I asked how she knew that, she just shrugged and said she must have overheard Nathan mention it earlier. But I was sitting right there the whole time, and Nathan definitely hadn't said anything about Highland Avenue. Then she turned to Chris and asked if he was still planning to move to Atlanta for that engineering position, which was something we'd been discussing privately just that morning while packing up our campsite. Chris shot me a look in the rearview mirror, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. None of us had mentioned anything about Atlanta or Chris's job prospects to this stranger. When Nathan asked her directly how she knew these things, Lisa just smiled and said she was good at reading people, then changed the subject to ask about the music we were playing. The atmosphere in the car shifted completely after that. What had been comfortable conversation turned into this tense silence where we were all processing what had just happened. Lisa seemed oblivious to our discomfort, or maybe she was just pretending to be. She started pointing out landmarks along the highway, mentioning specific mile markers and exit numbers like she'd driven this route hundreds of times. "There's a really good barbecue place at exit 47, she said, "and if you take the back road through Millbrook, there's this old cemetery that has the most interesting headstones." The way she talked about the area didn't match her story about being a stranded hiker who'd walked from some broken-down car. She knew details about local businesses, shortcuts, and even mentioned that there was usually a speed trap about 10 miles ahead, where the highway curved around a small lake. Nathan slowed down when we reached that exact spot, and sure enough, there was a state trooper sitting in the median with his radar gun out. Something else weird started happening around this time. Lisa stopped asking us questions or making conversation, and instead just sat there staring out the window, with this expression I can't really describe. It wasn't exactly a smile, but her mouth was curved slightly upward at the corners, and her eyes had this distant look like she was thinking about something that amused her. Every few minutes she'd glance at the back of Nathan's head, or look at Chris through the reflection in the passenger side mirror, but she never tried to make eye contact with me even though I was sitting right next to her. The silence stretched on for maybe 15 minutes, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of tires on asphalt. Chris tried to restart the conversation a couple of times, asking her about her teaching job or her hiking experience, but Lisa would just nod or give one-word answers without really engaging. The friendly, grateful woman who had climbed into our car was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to be waiting for something. Then I realized we'd been driving for almost an hour, and she hadn't once asked about Millbrook or mentioned getting out. Nathan had started slowing down as we approached what looked like the main part of town. There were more businesses, a few traffic lights, and signs indicating we were entering the city limits. But Lisa just sat there, completely silent, staring out at the passing buildings like she was sightseeing rather than looking for her destination. When Nathan finally asked, "Where in Millbrook do you need to go?" she took a long pause before answering, "Oh, just keep driving. I'll know it when I see it." That response made absolutely no sense for someone who supposedly needed to get to a specific place after being stranded for hours. Chris turned around in his seat to look at her directly and said, "Do you need us to find a police station or a tow service for your car?" Lisa just shook her head slowly and said, "No police," in this flat tone that made all three of us tense up immediately. We were now driving through what was clearly the heart of Millbrook, passing a courthouse, several shops, and a fire station. But Lisa showed no interest in getting out anywhere. Nathan kept driving, unsure of what else to do, while Chris and I exchanged increasingly worried glances. The whole situation had transformed from a simple good deed into something that felt genuinely threatening. Lisa's behavior was becoming more bizarre by the minute. She'd started humming under her breath, some tune I didn't recognize, and occasionally she'd chuckle softly to herself like she was remembering a private joke. At one point, she reached forward and lightly touched Nathan's shoulder, which made him jump so hard he nearly swerved. "Careful," she said in this sing-song voice. "We wouldn't want to have an accident." The way she said it sounded almost like a threat, and I noticed her fingernails were longer and sharper than I'd initially realized. Chris grabbed my wrist and squeezed it, which was our old signal from college that meant we needed to get out of whatever situation we were in. Just as we were leaving the town limits of Millbrook, we saw something that made all of us breathe a sigh of relief. A police checkpoint up ahead. There were 2 patrol cars parked at angles across the highway, creating a narrow passage that forced all traffic to slow down and stop. An officer was standing in the road with his hand up, directing each vehicle to pull forward for what looked like a routine inspection or sobriety check. Nathan immediately started slowing down, and I felt this wave of gratitude wash over me because finally, we'd have a chance to get some help with our increasingly disturbing passenger. But the moment Lisa saw the checkpoint, her entire demeanor changed instantly. She sat up straight. That strange half-smile disappeared from her face, and she suddenly looked alert and focused in a way that was completely different from her previous detached behavior. "Perfect," she said under her breath, and before any of us could react or ask what she meant, she grabbed the door handle and said, "This is my stop." The second Nathan brought the Explorer to a complete stop at the checkpoint, Lisa threw open the back door and bolted from the car like she was running from a fire. She didn't say goodbye, didn't thank us, didn't even look back. She just sprinted away from the highway and disappeared into a cluster of trees on the far side of the road. The police officer approached our window, clearly having witnessed Lisa's dramatic exit, and asked us what that was all about. We told him the whole story, how we'd picked her up, the strange things she'd said, her refusal to get out in town, and her bizarre behavior during the drive. The officer listened with growing concern and asked for a description of Lisa, which we provided in detail. He radioed for backup and told us to wait while they searched the area, but after 45 minutes of looking, they couldn't find any trace of her. What really disturbed the officer was when he told us there was no broken-down car anywhere within a 50-mile radius of where we'd found her, and no missing person reports matching her description. He also mentioned that there had been several reports over the past few months of a woman matching Lisa's appearance approaching drivers on remote highways, always with the same story about being stranded, but no one had ever reported what happened after they picked her up. We gave our contact information and drove away, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't encountered that checkpoint. The 3 of us barely talked for the rest of the drive home, and we've never taken another road trip together since. Sometimes I wonder if Lisa was waiting for us to reach some specific destination, or if she was just enjoying the fear she was creating. Either way, I'm grateful we'll never know what she really had planned.